While many modern roguelikes have adopted real-time gameplay mechanics, often presented in the form of platformers or isometric dungeon crawlers, traditional roguelikes featured synchronous turn-based movement and combat mechanics. And now comes the latest take on this formula in the form of Crown Trick, with its wonderfully animated visuals and a plethora of enemies, weapons, items and dungeon features. But does it do enough to warrant its mid-tier price tag, and could it potentially be the next big thing on the roguelike scene? Hopefully this review will help answer that question. My name's Gotcake and welcome to Star or Shovelware. So Crown Trick opens with a fantastic little animated cutscene where we see our main character Elle awakening from a snooze where she finds herself in a dungeon and is chased by some nasty green dog-like creature. She then finds herself surrounded by enemies, but not having any of it, she kicks all of their asses. And this essentially introduces us to the game's main theme and storyline, whereby our character enters dream realms populated by all kinds of monsters who are corrupting them, changing them into nightmares. Nightmares which have become some kind of sickness, trapping people within them with no way of escape. And so Elle is the world's last hope, the only one still able to enter the dream realms and battle the horrors within. Now our first run in the game acts as a bit of a tutorial, and here we meet a crown who grants us the powers necessary to end the nightmares. Now I found these tutorials did a good job of introducing us to the game's basic mechanics before kicking our ass, resulting in us waking up in the game's hub area. Here we find ourselves in a set of empty chambers, with no real option other than to fall asleep again and attempt our first proper run. Now there are a ton of different gameplay mechanics in Crown Trick which makes each dungeon run a unique experience. Each time we begin a run, the dungeon's layout and enemies are randomly generated, but we always start in a room which offers us a choice of weapons, familiars and occasionally a random relic. So the main gameplay loop sees us making our way through each floor's rooms, defeating enemies, collecting items and relics before facing the end of floor boss, and each room in the dungeon can contain a number of different encounters. Firstly, there are standard combat rooms containing a bunch of monsters we need to defeat in order to leave the room, and dispatching enemies can be done in several ways. Most of the time we'll be using our main weapon, and there's some great variety to weapons in Crown Trick, with them generally falling into two categories, ranged and melee, and we can only carry one weapon at a time. Each weapon comes with its own range and attack patterns indicated by handy little images on the weapon's card, and these cards also show the weapon's damage and skill power bonuses, as well as the weapon's perks, or aspects as they're known in Crown Trick, which are basically unique modifiers which can include chances to deal status effects to enemies, buffs to our character, or immunity to certain status effects. Weapons also come in 5 different rarities, with higher rarities offering more damage and power bonuses as well as additional aspects. So movement and combat in the game sees both Elle and enemies performing synchronous turn-based actions, meaning that whenever we move, attack or use an item, enemies will also perform an action, and the enemies that we encounter have both a health bar and a shield icon with a number on it. This shield indicates the number of attacks needed to break the enemy, which stuns it for a few turns, allowing us to get in some additional damage. And this break mechanic plays a big part when strategizing how to take on a group of enemies. Prior to enemies attacking, red markers are displayed on the floor where their attacks will land, which allows us to plan our next moves accordingly. And to help us position for attacks or dodge enemy attacks, we also have a blink ability with a limited number of charges, which allows us to teleport to a nearby space and doesn't count as a turn. Now in addition to weapons, we also find consumable items which activate spells or abilities that can be used to damage enemies or aid us in different ways, such as providing buffs or damage shields. We can also obtain relics from defeated enemies or from within chests, each of which provides our character with a huge variety of passive abilities, which stack and can potentially lead to some very powerful character builds. Now in some rooms we encounter sub-bosses who are much tougher than standard enemies, and after defeating these we're then able to equip them as a familiar, gaining their abilities for use in battle. We can only equip 2 familiars at one time, and crystals found throughout the dungeons allow us to swap between the familiars that we've unlocked. The abilities we gain from them cost mana to cast, which can be seen in the bottom left below our health bar. And both mana and our blink charges are restored each time we enter combat. Our health on the other hand doesn't regenerate on its own, but we can recover a portion of our health and mana by consuming the potion seen next to the bars. This however has a limited number of uses per floor, but it can be refilled after each floor. Now, I've just briefly covered the majority of the game's combat related mechanics, and whilst there's a lot of depth to them and they sound complex, they actually didn't take me that long to get used to. The rooms we battle in also contain a bunch of different explosive barrels, contraptions, traps and floor tiles, adding even more strategy and depth to encounters, but I'll leave those as little surprises for you to discover on your own. So as well as standard combat rooms, there are also a ton of other room types that make up dungeon layouts. Firstly, we have treasure rooms which feature items locked within areas that we're unable to blink into, and instead we have to find dream keys dropped by enemies to open them. There are rooms containing monoliths that we can activate which initiate random events, often requiring us to select from a bunch of options, each having a percentage chance for a particular outcome, and these usually reward us with items or currency. Next we have cursed rooms containing chests or idols which provide us with items or buffs, but these come at a cost, often applying negative buffs or requiring us to sacrifice health to obtain them. Finally, we have 2 gambling rooms, where we can spend the gold that we collect for a chance to earn additional weapons and items. The first is a slot machine where we can spin the reels to earn points, which we can then exchange for prizes. And the second is a gacha machine where we can obtain various weapons. We're able to spend gold to switch the available rewards, and we can also ban unwanted weapons, but this increases the cost per spin. Now, after making our way to the end of levels, we get to fight the end of level boss. Each of these present quite challenging fights, and bosses have their own unique attack patterns and room mechanics, which often take several attempts and failures to master. Defeating a boss rewards a bunch of loot, including items, relics, weapons and currency, as well as stat scrolls which can be used to improve our character's attack and defense stats, and blueprints which unlock new weapons and relics for subsequent dungeon runs. We then head down to the next floor, and between dungeon floors we find a floor containing a fountain which we can refill our potions at, as well as a shop where we can spend gold to buy items, weapons and relics. Once we're done on this floor, it's then on to the next dungeon floor and boss. Now, the first dungeon in the game consists of 4 dungeon floors, introducing us to Crown Trick's 4 main bosses. I found this first dungeon relatively challenging, but I have to say that it felt more accessible and forgiving than my first steps in many other roguelike games. After completing the first dungeon, we then move on to day 2, which opens up the next 3 dungeons, and here the real game starts as the difficulty is ramped up considerably, with rooms containing more powerful enemies and a ton more environmental hazards. I have to say that I was a little surprised with this difficulty spike, as I found gameplay significantly more challenging compared to the initial dungeon. There's no way to actually reduce the game's difficulty or return to the first dungeon for more practice, which I can see being problematic for some players. Now, failing or completing a dungeon will see us return to the hub area, and after completing the first dungeon you will have unlocked several NPCs offering services in exchange for blue soul shards obtained within dungeons. 3 of the NPCs have skill trees which you can unlock nodes on, providing a bunch of different passive abilities which include increases to your potion charges and effectiveness, the amount of golden soul shards dropped in dungeons, and increases to the number of items that you can carry. There's also a blacksmith NPC where you can unlock additional random aspects which will then appear on weapons that you find, and the familiar crystal allows you to unlock new weapons and relics, as well as additional passive bonuses for equipping different familiars. Now, there are a bunch of other gameplay mechanics that open up once you get to the second set of dungeons, but I feel like I've already covered a ton of stuff which should at least give you some idea of how varied and random runs in Crown Trick can be. I personally had a great time playing Crown Trick, and I thought the devs did a great job of implementing the game's mechanics, and I love the variety that they brought to the game. But this also leads me to my main criticism of the game, as I could definitely see some people initially feeling overwhelmed by the sheer number of different mechanics. The game's combat can also feel pretty chaotic and unfair at times with its enemy encounters and boss battles, and I often struggled to create a decent character build due to the variety of modifiers offered by relics and weapons. Now, I want to end by saying that I haven't yet completed Crown Trick, but so far I've found a ton of replayability in its dungeons, despite the limited visual themes and repeated floor bosses. So now let's get on to rating the game. Now, I rate games between 1 and 5 stars, with a shovelware stamp of approval reserved for the worst games on the eShop. This rating is based on my own personal opinion on the quality and quantity of a title's gameplay, and whether or not I feel it offers value for money to potential buyers. For a rating, I'd give Crown Trick 3 out of 5 stars. Crown Trick has a ton of stuff going on, and though it offers a few of its own unique mechanics, many of its features you'll no doubt have encountered before in other roguelikes. And while I had a great time playing and would recommend giving it a go, I felt the game potentially offered too much variety and random to players, which may just prove to be its undoing. You can get Crown Trick from the UK Switch eShop, where it's usually priced at £14.99, or from the US eShop for $19.99. Alternatively, the game's also available on Steam. So before I end this review, I want to take a brief moment to let you know about the Star or Shovelware Patreon page, where those who want to can become a member and gain access to exclusive behind the scenes videos with a more personal touch. I want to also thank my first few Patreons, as it means a lot and I really appreciate the additional support you guys provide to both me and the channel. And so that's it for this review of Crown Trick, so hit that like button if it helped you out, and let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Don't forget to subscribe for future Switch reviews and content, and join the Starseekers Discord server to become part of its growing community. For now though, I just want to say thanks once again for watching, and until next time, take care and game on.